Valentine's Day is around the corner, so I thought it would be really fun to illustrate a Valentine's Day card. I had this idea early on in January when I was trying to practice drawing every day. I'm still working on improving that habit, and I haven't quite gotten there, but I did have some decent little doodles, and I really liked this little couple of drawings that I did with me and my boyfriend in our onesies. So I was originally going to have us in like a dinosaur onesies because those are the ones that we have. We have some other animal ones and I thought that those could be cute too. But I also didn't want them to take away from the rest of the illustration, and I also wanted to make it more Valentine's Day theme-ish. So I ended up changing the onesies all together and turning them into a really cute Valentine's Day pattern instead. I struggled a lot with figuring out the posing. I sketched probably 3 or 4 initial poses before I was really settled on this one that you see me working on. I really liked this pose a lot because I thought that it would be really cute and expressive. I am not entirely happy with how the finished sketch turned out. I did end up painting it and everything already, but I have already redrawn it and I've pushed the pose a lot more in another drawing that I kind of like more. So I might end up redoing this, but I also wanted to get this out and share the art process. So I continued working on this pose, trying to get the characters to work. I think that it ends up being ultimately more stiff than I intended for it. I was also really struggling with figuring out my style at the time, so everything that I've been drawing lately has been fluctuating a lot in art style as I shape what I want my art to look like. Working on these poses was really frustrating, and over the last couple of weeks where I've been developing my illustrations more or just spending more time practicing in general, I've noticed that I work really hard to develop what I want to draw, and I get to this point where I get super frustrated with what I'm working on and get to this point where I kind of just want to give up on what I'm doing altogether. But then I put it aside, take a break for a day or two, and come back with fresh eyes and a fresh mindset because I always come back and feel a lot better about the decisions that I made while I was working on the ideas. That happened when I was trying to figure this pose out more with these sketches. I was really struggling with the pose of the female character that is inspired by myself. Getting the correct position of that lifted leg was really weird, and trying to draw the foot properly in that perspective was also really tricky. I worked really hard on this pose, and once I was really happy with how it came out, I was being really precious with the traditional sketch, and I really didn't want to have to erase anything for adding these details that I wanted in the illustration. So I decided to take a picture with my iPad and add those details on top digitally. I moved around my art studio a lot. I was working on the iPad from my chair, and later on I went under my desk with my iPad to transfer the sketch to the finished painting surface, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So I was really liking how the digital sketches were turning out, but like I said, I had a really hard time trying to figure out how to make the animal onesies work with this pose. I didn't want it to cover up too much of the body or take away any of the expressiveness that I captured, especially because it would have a tail that would cover up the legs that I spent a really long time trying to figure out how to draw correctly. I find that when I'm working on my illustrations digitally, it's a lot lower pressure. It's not as stressful because I can just click away any mistakes as if they had never happened, or I can use a lasso tool to push and change them so that way they aren't, so that I can adjust them more to what I want them to be. And it makes the process a lot easier. I just find it really difficult to draw digitally because I just really love the physical aspect of traditional artwork. So I try to avoid using my iPad a lot, but I think that it's really important for some work to get to the point that I want it to. And you'll see in the digital sketch, I come up with the pattern that I want for the onesies. I end up changing that for our male character, but I kind of just wanted to have a base idea of the pattern and didn't want to have to draw it all throughout the onesie. I initially started off by giving both of them stripes, and I didn't show that part because it was really long and tedious. Once I was getting closer to transferring the sketch to our finished painting surface, I had to go in and draw the hands and feet. And it's kind of funny because I kind of just get the shape of them when I trace it onto the watercolor paper. And then I have to go in and redefine these shapes. I tend to do that a lot with my sketches, where I will try to make the sketch as easy as possible, whether it's digital or traditional, but once I get to the final painting surface, I always end up changing the hands or feet because they weren't perfect yet. I also find that sometimes when I'm transferring the sketch, I tend to make the finished painting, the finished sketch for the painting more stiff than the sketch that I have on a different surface, whether it was my iPad or another sheet of paper, so I try to be very loose with it. If I'm transferring it from my iPad or using my lightbox, the best place to do it is somewhere that's kind of dark. So I often will go under my desk with it when I'm going to trace the sketch so that it shows up better and it's easier for me to see. I also try not to include it too much in videos because it's really dark when it's captured on camera, and I've noticed that people kind of drop off on those parts of the video. So I try to lighten up that scene a little bit, make it easier for you guys to see. Let me know what you think of the color grading, because there was a lot of that throughout this video because I did all of this on a very cloudy day and none of the lighting was very consistent, so I hope that it all looks good together. So I've had these little watercolor cards and envelopes for a really long time. I don't really make cards for people as much as I think I should, and I thought that maybe I should finally start doing that. I think that it was probably like a set that was gifted to me and I just forgot about it, or I bought it and just tucked it away and forgot about it. So when I went into the painting process, I started with a yellow wash like I always do. This is my favorite thing to do, especially if the characters are going to be in this white space where there isn't really a background. It helps me differentiate the character from the background, and if I skip this step, I often make mistakes that are really hard to remove by going outside of the lines. And this just helps me make sure that the parts that I'm painting are the parts that I should be painting. I think it also adds a good layer of cohesion to the illustration because it gives every color that I put on top of it this yellow undertone and keeps everything to being quite similar. Even if I were to go in with a really dark color, it would still have a little bit of that yellow mixed in with the color I put over the top. I've really been enjoying this yellow-blue combination at the start of my illustrations, going in with mostly yellow. If I feel like defining the highlights, I will use the yellow for the highlights. In this case, I just used the yellow for everything, and then used a tealy blue for the shadows, and then a darker blue for the further parts of the shadow areas. I thought that they were really pretty gradients, and although they're kind of hard to see once I layer on all of the local colors, I always really love how satisfying this stage is. This is also a really great way for me to start establishing the values. Something that I struggle with a lot is making sure that I get enough value diversity in my watercolor illustrations. It's really easy to make everything a very light color, and especially if you lay down this wash that looks darker when it's wet and then it dries lighter than what you put down. That's why I often tend to go over the darker areas with very similar colors to layer them and try to get a darker value, especially with like the hair, for example. When I've been painting skin, I've really enjoyed adding in a little bit of blush in this wet layer for the base color. It really helps me get in the rosiness of the cheeks before I go in with any shading. I really loved the colors that I picked for this illustration. I felt like the color choices worked really well, especially our skin tones. I will often paint myself too dark or too light and then try to paint my boyfriend in a way where it helps make my skin tone appear more correct, if that makes any sense. Whereas he's supposed to be lighter than me because he is paler than me, so if I make him a little bit darker because I made myself too dark, it helps balance out and make it so that I don't look as dark as I put down. I really loved the color choice of our hair too. I think that that first wash was very strong, and most of the time I end up putting down washes that are way too light and don't really bring in those values like I had said before. I usually have to layer and get them to the level that I need them to be for the colors to match what they should be. So I thought about making our onesies the same color overall. I was really excited to do pink for both of us. However, I also realized that we would kind of look like one big blob if we were the same colors, and I really wanted to maintain the definition of there being two different colors. And this was also a great opportunity for me to bring in some more values instead of both of us being in lighter toned clothing. So my onesie is going to be a lighter pink, and then his is going to be a red, except I made it look appear darker towards the end, and I really liked the effect it gave where I did a negative coloring pattern, if that makes any sense, with the stripe pattern that I picked out for his onesie. I also thought it would be a well-balanced contrast, considering I always paint my skin and hair darker than his skin and hair, so giving myself the lighter colored clothing and him the darker colored clothing would give a little bit of balance. Before I went in with the pattern, I did want to make sure that there was a little bit of shading on the clothing. I am struggling a lot with figuring out how I want to shade a lot of things when it comes to my watercolor illustrations. I'm trying to figure out what kind of rendering style I want to have and how to capture it. I have this tendency to try to blend everything out and make everything look super soft and smooth, but then there isn't any contrast of hard shadow lines, so everything looks over blended, and I still want there to be a good definition and contrast for a lot of areas in my illustrations. Most of the shading is pretty much eyeballed. I only did one shadow pass with my onesie, and I think that I needed to do two for my boyfriend's onesie so that way it could look darker. I wanted there to be a very clear distinction from my onesie being very light and his being very dark, and I also didn't want to worry about those shadow areas being lost in translation when I go over it with the stripe patterns. Once I had all the base colors down, I tried to render out the faces. I had a lot of struggles with this because I definitely didn't have the right brush, or at least I wasn't using the right brush for this. I was also defining the feet and hands, but I was really struggling with the face. As you can see, I'm using this flat rounded brush. I don't remember what they're called. And I should have really been using a very small round brush. A lot of times when I paint hair in my illustrations, I have been going overboard by trying to detail and render showing the strands of the hair and whatnot, and I don't really have a good grasp on how to paint hair, so I went with just a two-toned hair shading, just kind of shading the general areas and trying not to add too much. I did want to emphasize the braids in my hair, however. Another thing that I've been trying to experiment a lot with is outlines. I'm trying to get used to using them in some areas and trying to leave other areas not outlined, but I'm having a really hard time knowing when to use them and when not to use them. I think I ended up just outlining everything because I wasn't really sure if it was helping or hurting the illustration. So the pattern that I put on the onesie for the character that is based off of me is the same one that I did digitally, except every other set of hearts was either filled in or empty, as you can see in this little illustration. I really liked this idea. It was a very last minute decision, and I thought that both of the stripe patterns that I came up with were really cute. They were pretty tedious to paint with this small brush, but I had a lot of fun doing it, and once they were done, I felt like it brought the illustration together. I tried my best to follow the form of the clothing, trying to imply the dimensionality of the characters. I don't know if it reads very well. I think that they both look very puffy, but I did try my best. So now I can talk about this inverted patterning that I did for my boyfriend's character. So the red that I used for his onesie wasn't quite as dark in contrast now that I had these darker stripes on the other onesie. So I wanted to do the same heart pattern except fill in the space around the hearts instead of the hearts themselves. And I think that this definitely helped bump up the contrast between the two onesies. I also changed up the pattern a tiny bit with some smaller hearts, and I think that that was a really cute variation to throw in there. Painting in the pattern towards the end was very therapeutic because I was really excited to see how the piece came together once I saw how well the first onesie turned out. And I was really happy once everything dried that the shading of the onesies themselves really showed through the pattern, so there was still a good amount of shading despite there being the variation in design. And that's really it for the illustration process. This was a really fun little card to work on, and I really enjoyed doing this little illustration. Even though it's not perfect and there are quite a few things that I think I would change about it now, I still think it turned out really cute. I will have to show the other sketch that I did on screen so you guys can see how that one is looking. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for more art videos like this one. Let me know what you think of this card in the comments, and let me know what you have planned for Valentine's Day. Thanks for watching. Bye.